জল দেবে একটা ছোট্টখানি?
Good evening, viewers, and welcome to Candid Talk, episode 5. Today's session is entitled Breaking the Mold. And our guest today is one of the foremost thinkers of our time, Dipesh Chakrabarty. He's the Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor in History at the University of Chicago. But that's just his day job. Actually, he's equally passionate and knowledgeable about a range of other domains, including comparative literature, philosophy, physics, mathematics, geology, ecology, climate change. Over the years, he's been honored with a number of accolades and awards, including the Toynbee Prize, named after Arnold Toynbee, which he won in 2014. And this prize recognizes social scientists for significant academic and public contributions to humanity. Now, intellectually, the heritage that he carries, the mantle of heritage that he dons, can be traced back to the great European thinkers of the Enlightenment. And yet, at the same time, when one looks at his personal sensibilities, his connection with popular culture, music, movies, cuisine, and even his love for Adda, in all of these, he remains a quintessential Bengali. Dipeshda, good morning, a very warm welcome to you.
Good morning from Chicago, and thank you for having me on your program.
Dipeshda, I was thinking maybe we start our Adda with a few thoughts on the concept and practice of Adda itself, right? I mean, especially for us Bengalis in Kolkata, this is as dear to us as our morning cup of tea, as our rice and fish curry. But you have studied this, you have looked at the institution of Adda critically. Tell us about your findings.
Well, I looked at it both critically and with affection, and with a certain degree of nostalgia. Partly because I've lived overseas now for the major part of my life, and so I don't get to enjoy Adda as much as I would like to, and secondly also because Adda itself, I mean, for all our love for it, the particular form of Adda that people have written about and reminisced about may be a waning institution in the sense that, Adda belongs to a society where speech is valued. So Adda is a face-to-face collection of people, and people where people actually talk. And talk interestingly, at least some people on various subjects. They hold forth. But the more interesting side of Adda is that in an Adda, you can present yourself as a character. So if you read about the Adda that Satyajit Ray was a part of, Satyajit Ray, all these people, you will find that Kamal Kumar Majumdar, the famous writer, often presented himself as a character. And a character is by definition a two-dimensional person. I mean, somebody who's a character is not a flesh and blood representation of himself or herself. Right?
It's a prototype. It's representative of something.
It's a product, and you present yourself. You produce yourself as that. It's not a stereotype, but as that character that people expect you to be. And you come up with statements that affirm people's sense of the kind of character you are. Right.
Yes.
So that's why it sort of belongs to a society that values speech, that values face-to-face presence. I mean, apart from the fact that currently we don't have much face-to-faceness in physical terms.
Yes.
But what happens is that if you look at most of our interaction these days through the electronic medium, in Adda, you tell jokes. On WhatsApp, you read jokes. So,
Right.
so when humor moves to the written medium, you have the semblance of adda between friends, and sometimes friends on WhatsApp forward me a joke without any comment, and it's a way of saying hello, keeping in touch, knowing that Indians love a good joke.
Right.
But in an adda, one actually performs. One tells a joke that's not circulated, and that connection between what you read and what you talk about was very close. So for instance, Kamal Kumar Majumdar had a collection of jokes about 19th century eminent Bengalis, and he called it Ishwar Kotir Rangakotu or Rangakotu, something like that. And there he has jokes about Ramakrishna Dev, or Rammohun Roy, all these people that he had collected, obviously from written sources. But then we in our addas would repeat those jokes orally.
Right.
So this rich connection between the world of written language and the world of spoken language, the world of performance, and performance becoming stories, and in print, and then coming back as somebody else's performance. So somebody else who in another adda, somebody who is repeating a joke that Kamal Majumdar cracked,
Right.
would also have to perform Kamal Babu.
Absolutely.
For the joke to be effective.
So it gains
right?
by that repetition, right? It gains by that performance.
Right.
It gains a new valency,
Right.
and it is sustained. The
Right.
original import of it is also sustained, right? So Dipesh,
Right.
the other interest. Sorry, go on.
So I was going to say that so when I looked at adda, I mean adda obviously had very multiple origins. So you can think of the rural Chondi Mondop where people collected as a form of adda. In Hindi, any place of collection you call adda.
Bus adda. Yes.
Hawai adda.
Yes.
Hawai adda, right? So the word has all these multiple origins. But what I got interested in was in the question how adda became respectable in Bengali modernity. How it got to be associated with literary people, film people. So it was kind of our version of the salon, our version of the Bloomsbury Group, right? So, and every college street had so many addas. Every little magazine or a literary magazine had its own adda, Porichoy adda, kind of. So
Absolutely.
I was very interested in understanding how adda became a highly valued, so respectable in our culture that Bengalis were happy to be identified as people who are, and the Persianized the word, saying adda baj. Baj is a Persian.
Baj is Persian. A practitioner of that, or an exponent of X of something.
Right, exactly. Yeah, right. And so much so that Syed Mustafa Ali, who was one of the famous adda baj people and a raconteur, actually claimed in one of his writings that, having been a world traveler as well, he said that Bengalis are only second to the men in Egypt, in Cairo, in being devoted to the institution of adda.
Yeah.
Because apparently the men in Cairo were even more neglectful of their household duties when it came to the question of gathering with other men. But at the same time, there were also class dimensions to adda, gender dimensions to adda.
Yes.
So there were men's adda. Sometimes women were the suppliers of the food and things, and sometimes lower class people are suppliers of the cha that actually keeps adda going. So
Dipesh, there are a couple of things that you talk about, right? One is, as a reaction to that, the women folk also start to have their own addas, right? In congregating in places and in confines where they can meet, and they can also have their own version of the adda, right?
That actually is also an old tradition. So it's not in reaction. Women actually have always had their addas. I mean, every Bengali family will have a woman who's a wonderful storyteller.
Right.
And particularly when you get accounts of familial or a gathering of friends, which is kind of gender segregated. So the women are in one corner, men are in another corner. But you will find a woman who is a raconteur holding forth among women and regaling everybody. My mother was a storyteller, and she was a school teacher in a girls' school. And she was very much the teller of tales in the teachers' common room. And so it was sometimes segregated, but in literary circles, not so much. So literary circles would have some women as part of that, but generally segregated. But there's a old tradition of women being performers
Indeed.
in gender
Indeed.
segregated settings.
Indeed. Dipesh, you talked about your mother being a great storyteller in an old way. Take us back to your formative years. Let's say around the time when you were growing up, you're going to school. What was the atmosphere like at home and at school?
So, we sort of my life started out in the Park Circus area of Calcutta. And my family is from East Bengal, so I am what they call a Bangal. But my mother's family had migrated just before the partition. And my mother migrated as she got married in the 40s. My father's family had kind of come over to Calcutta much earlier.
Much earlier.
So they had so they used to go back for holidays, but my mother was much more of a Dhaka girl, And so I grew up with very strong memories in my mother, but passed on to me and to my sister, of East Bengal and Dhaka and Naranganj and Faridpur, where my mother passed her BA. She eventually did away from Calcutta University. And memories of partition. And one of the things that I later realized, there were artifacts in the apartment we rented. There were artifacts that were quite obviously Muslim. And I asked eventually, as I grew up, I asked my parents about those. And then I realized that there was a Muslim family that used to live in that building and in that apartment. And the house was owned by a Muslim gentleman. And when they left, somebody else bought the house, and my father bought the furniture and the stuff that was left. So I always say that there were Hindus and Muslims fighting and killing each other and dividing the country, but the most intimate life of my parents probably had a continuity with the most intimate life of a Muslim couple. Because that was the same bed. Right? So their marital bed became my parents' marital bed. Right, some of the same furniture. So it's fascinating how in the middle of kind of a really bloody conflict and a lot of pain and a lot of separation and a lot of relationships breaking up, there's still this unintended, unwilled instances of intimacies that are not intentional intimacies. But they are kind of historically produced intimacies that you can't quite disavow, except by pretending that it didn't exist, that they didn't exist.
Right. Indeed.
So that was I think one formative influence in my childhood, and then of course we moved to Tullygunge, where my father built a small house, and that was actually, it was not part of Calcutta, the corporation areas yet. It soon became part of it, but when we moved there sometime in the 50s, it was still an area where you encountered snakes and foxes, and you used to hear jackals in the evening. And of course, the area was famous for the size of its mosquitoes. But so the other influence was the Pada, the neighborhood club, and being part of the neighborhood. And there were a lot of families from East Bengal, and but it was typical Calcutta, where the local club, which organized pujas, but as well as sporting activities, was kind of the hub of the neighborhood and held it together. And apart from school, the other big influence in my growing up, in my childhood and even sort of into my teens, was an institution called the Children's Little Theatre, or Shishu Rong Mahal in Bangla, which was now housed in this building called Obon Mahal, near Dhakuria Bridge. where it's next door to the Armory Hospital.
Okay. Yes.
But the Armory Hospital didn't exist. Right? So
Of
that
course,
was, but that used to be near the Shuprio Park on Tilak Road, and in fact, some of my friends, probably watching this, are friends from my CLT days. Right?
Okay.
And both my sister and I were members of the students' theatre organization, and that became a huge influence on me, because I got to do things with Ravi Shankar once, because he came and set one of the plays to music. He set the score for it, and I was one of the young boys providing the voices for some of the characters.
So which year was this, Dipesh? When was this?
I think I joined it. I joined it late, because they used to take kids from the time when they were 5, and I probably joined it when I was about 10 or 11, because I only had 2 years of traineeship, because you had to quit being a trainee at 12. But then we loved the place so much that Mr. Shamar Chatterjee, who built the institution, and Shamar, they made allowances for made it possible for us to continue. We had a drama club, and we had a wonderful production of Lokhone Shokti Shell, and so that was a big influence. School was important, and I studied in 2 schools, Andrew School in Dhakuria, from where I gather from the website. Shobhashati Chakrabarty, the actor, is also alum. But I actually finished from Mitra Institution in Bhawanipur. So I finished from there.
Right.
And I still have friends from my school days. And school was fun. And then, of course, then childhood, childhood finished when I became interested in lefty ideas.
So let's go back a little bit.
High school.
So let's go back a little bit to the school days again, and something that hasn't changed over generations, right? When a student is about to embark on the class 9 or the 9th standard, there's always this momentous decision that the guardians and parents and the child has to go through. Is he or she going to take science, or is it going to be arts, or is it going to be commerce, right? That age-old question. So I'm sure in your family as well, you face the same question. So what kind of discussions went into the decision for you to take up science?
Well, after later in life, when I actually started getting interested in history. So this was after my post-graduation, after graduating from IIM Calcutta. My father would remind me that when I chose the science stream in school, my headmaster always told my father, "Why are you putting him into the sciences? He belongs to the humanities." And I think there was a lot of truth to that, because my favorite subject, the most favorite subject, was Bangla. And within Bangla, I used to love reading the Vaishnav Bhagavatis, because I used to love reading my mother's MA class books. And as people do in imitation of Tagore, I tried writing some padas myself, and I remember basically it was funny because I had to create my own glossary of terms that were not current in modern Bangla, right? Sort of reading, let's say, Vidyapati or Chandidas, or Chandidas, and then I would look at my glossary to find rhyming words that would belong to that age. But it wasn't anything good. But at the same time, I must say that from college on, I got too involved in politics and things. But actually, science. I don't regret having done some science, because I think science and mathematics. I used to love geometry. I used to love some algebra. I was always a little dyslexic with numbers, so I used to have trouble with arithmetic because I just see numbers wrong. You tell me a phone number, and I'll write it down wrong. You tell me an address, I'll write the street number wrong. But that I know I have a problem with.
Dipishda, I'm wondering
Yeah.
whether the choice to study science in school and that segueing into studying physics honors in presidency also has a little bit to do with sort of societal signaling. So, in the sense that a
Pressure.
meritorious student studies physics in presidency honors, even if he or she
Yeah,
can
because
study
because
engineering or arts, right?
because the main worry, I mean, I used to sing as well. I mean, I was not a great singer, and I didn't, but I could sing, and I through those CLT connections, I actually sang a playback song for a Bengali film, and because they couldn't get many boys to sing for films, quite a few offers came, and my father said, "No, you shouldn't do that. That will distract you from studies." There was also this middle class Bengali fear that if you do humanities, humanities won't prepare you well for
Getting a
earning a
job.
decent livelihood,
Mhm, mhm.
uh, getting a job. But the expression was much more crass. How will you secure your food if you do an MA? I mean, in Bangla it's a khabiki. What will you
Ha,
eat
ha, ha, ha.
if you do that? So, and plus there was a certain kind of prestige accruing to the sciences because of the emphasis that Nehru's government, through the late 50s and early 60s, that put on the sciences. And as I
Mhm,
always say,
mhm.
that this was the time when engineering was becoming prestigious because you saw in the matrimonial columns that people would always want engineers for fair complexioned girls, and there would be sometimes there would be an additional sentence saying, I mean, even a teacher will do, or something to that effect, right? So you knew that the prestige was actually accruing to the sciences, and for a young boy, it was very easy to be moved by those considerations as well.
Absolutely.
But
Mhm.
actually, but there are a lot of aspects of the science I studied in high school which I really loved and enjoyed and was uh, very good. I mean, I really think I was very glad that I was exposed to all that.
Right. And I think, Dipesh, it's fair to say that abiding love and the learning from science has remained with you throughout your life, which allows you to do so much of sort of multidisciplinary work, which many other academics would shy well clear of.
Well, I mean, one of the things, again, going back to childhood, was that my father was, uh, he had his master's was in physics. I mean, he did some research, but because of family reasons, he couldn't continue and managed a small factory instead. But my father was like some other fathers, but now I realize not like every father. I mean, it's interesting what things fathers get their children interested in. And my father would always ask me questions like, why do you think the sky is blue? Why do you think it turns red in the morning and in the afternoon? So, in some ways, questions that in the 17th century would have been called natural philosophy questions.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
Um, and we would have thought of them as physics questions. So he would ask those questions, and those questions have never left me. I mean, he would explain why tree leaves were green. So he would try to explain to me the process of photosynthesis and what happened. So he generated, just as my mother generated in me a tremendous love for
That's for
literature
Bengali literature.
East, and for East Bengal in particular. I mean, I have a tremendous love for Dhaka and friends in Bangladesh. I mean, I consider myself sort of, in part Bangladeshi for that reason, which comes purely out of what my mother gave me, and love of East Bengal songs and all those things. But at the same time, my father also gave me this, um, and he himself was very interested in mathematics. I mean, I was not as good as he was. So, but he was also an influence in that very deep sense.
Indeed, indeed.
So
So,
yes, I'm
Dipesh,
going back to your question. So
yeah,
sorry, carry on.
Deepika, we were talking about when you got into college, right? I lost the thread there and I want to pick it up again. And you said that you got heavily
Right,
involved in politics. So talk to us about the pressy
right,
of that time, right? In the political milieu, the ambience there, and your involvement, at least for a
right.
short time, very deep involvement with the Naxal
So
movement.
yeah, yeah. So what happened was by the time I was in high school, um, in my final years of high school, we had 11 years schooling. I had all, I'd become intimate with somebody who was like an older brother figure who used to live downstairs from us and who used to study chemistry in Presidency College. And they had moved from Chittagong much later. I mean, he actually finished his high school in Chittagong and then came to stay with his uncle in our head place and to study. And they were already communists. And I used to have big arguments with him when I was in high school. I mean, we used to discuss everything from mathematics, science to politics. And I used to lose all the political arguments, which he used to win. I mean, I was a nationalist Vivekanandaite or something. So whenever I came up with an argument, and he'd say, "Oh, no, your Vivekananda can't solve this problem. You need Marx for this." And I didn't know any Marx. Nor did he know much. But he was better at this argumentation. So I thought I'd rather be with the winning side of this argument. Why should I keep losing? So I allowed myself to be convinced that we needed some sort of revolution. But you see, imagine a young person in their early teens growing up to the first major, growing up to the India-China border dispute, which made us nationalist. But soon all these communists were actually coming up with other evidence, questioning India's version of what had happened, right? With all this Western literature, which were proscribed, but they were available. People would give you books to read. And then the food crisis of 64, 65, which brought the left eventually to power. The CPIM was formed in 64. So my kind of middle teens coincided with the decline of the Congress, which was the party my father supported, and with the rise of the left. And my emotions were caught up. So as I was kind of moving towards some youthful idea of what Marxism was, but my emotions were totally caught up with the rise of this party. And I went to college knowing that I was going to get involved in politics, but I had no idea how involved I would be and how that would affect my studies. And, I think what happens at that age is sometimes with some people, problems of adolescence get mixed up with political emotions, other kinds of emotions. So I would say I probably had, even beyond college, 6 or 7 years of deep internal strife and restlessness. So it was a deep, very close and personal experience. This was before the Naxalite rebellion happened. So if you remember, the Naxalite rebellion happened in 67, after the left government had been voted into power. So I was in college by the end of 65, or 66, I think. I forget, but 66, at the end of 66, there was a huge big strike. The college was closed for 3 or 4 months. I got very involved in that strike, along with many friends, thinking, and as our friends thought, Naxalbari hadn't happened, but we thought the strike was going to presage a revolution. A full-scale revolution across the land. Full-scale revolution. That this was the beginning of it. And we were very, very disappointed when the CPIM leadership came to us and told, you have to withdraw the strike because the elections are coming. And we thought, people were grumbling, say this party was revisionist. They give elections more importance than revolution. So even before Naxalbari happened, there was some disaffection brewing in these younger people. And this is happening in the context of the split between China and the Soviet Union. And we were all reading clandestine Chinese literature. Clandestine because they were again banned, because India and China had fought a war. So when Naxalbari happened, it literally was the trigger that everybody in this kind of mood was waiting for. And what happened was, I got very involved in the strike, but the strike produced a sense of crisis in my middle class family. My mother became very unwell. Everybody was disappointed. My relationships were under stress. And when the strike ended, I was quite sick. When the strike ended, our leader said to me, "You will now have to you'll have to take charge of the student union." That was not the difficult thought, but he said, "You have to leave home and come and live with us." And I had seen how they lived. They lived really from hand to mouth, here today, there tomorrow, being hounded by the police. And with my middle class background, I I was completely scared by that prospect. So I chickened out, and I told them. So they said they were disappointed. They said, you have to say this to everybody in an open public meeting. So there was a meeting on the lawns of Presidency College, on the lawns, and then like there was sort of 60, 70, 100 people present, all these young people, and I had to self-denounce. I had to tell them how bad I was, how I suffered from typical petty bourgeois vices, and they passed a resolution, a formal resolution condemning my attitudes. But later on, a friend in the movement who was also given to physical fights told me later on the only reason he didn't rough me up was because I'd been honest. But what happened was all my friends stopped talking to me overnight. And I couldn't actually sit. I was not prepared enough to sit for the exam that year. So I actually moved back and eventually graduated with the following batch.
With the following batch, right.
Yeah, and I made friends, and they're also lifelong friends, and some of them probably are watching and listening in. So so my college years are associated today in my head with the crisis of adolescence and a certain degree of restlessness, which actually wasn't resolved, I tell you, until I was 50. So there's a restlessness, which is part of which is personal, but part of it also had to do with my relationship, intellectual. The intellectual side is my relationship with Calcutta Bengali Marxism. Because eventually, when I became a historian, I was part of a collection of Marxist historians, and I was always. And my relationship to the Marxism I received in Calcutta was always troubled. And that troubling aspect eventually left me. When I was 50, after I'd written my first two books, I kind of settled accounts with the Marxism I had inherited in Calcutta, right? So
Dipesh, let's talk a little bit about the Marxist influence in Kolkata, the consistent and sort of continual Marxist influence. So, for example, today in 2020, nobody in their right state of mind would ever associate, for example, I Am Calcutta, right, with anything to do with discourses or lectures on Marxism.
Right.
Whereas after Pressy, when you joined I Am Calcutta, it was a completely different environment. You not just had luminaries like Borunde, but you actually had Marx taught from a different perspective in class. Tell us about the I Am Calcutta days.
No, I Am was a fest. So the I Am story itself is very interesting. Why the I Ams were formed. See, basically, if you may not remember, you were not there, but you might know from your knowledge that India passed a law against monopolies, and we had a Monopolies and Trade Restrictive Practices Commission, an MRTP commission, it was called, in the 50s. Because the sense was in Nehru and people that as India would industrialize, the business families themselves would not have enough demographic strength to create a pool of managers that the country would need. So they sent, actually, Humayun Kabir was the education minister when this discussion started. And they sent a delegation to the United States to look at business schools, which had come up in the United States before the war. And the Americans got quite involved in this discussion. And eventually the Americans suggested, okay, you should have it in Bombay because that's the business center. But Bombay University hated that. But the Americans also said, because your universities are of the British type, very conservative, you can't have an American type institution as part of this British type universities.
Right. Indeed.
And so they were going to, so eventually Bombay University wouldn't have that. So they chose Ahmedabad as their next preferred site. Right? They were not going to have one in Calcutta, which they said, no, it's a declining industry, it doesn't work. B.C. Roy was the person who persuaded Nehru to make sure that Calcutta had one as well. So the two IIMs were opened, I think, around 1962. But the interesting thing about the Calcutta IIM was that because Calcutta University would not yet appoint Marxists easily, there were a lot of displaced good Marxist academics who got jobs at IIM. And in my time, the IIM in Calcutta and the IIM in Ahmedabad were the two business schools in the world that had history as a compulsory subject in your first term. And so Barundev and Chandra Bhattacharya were our kind of Marxist history teachers. So the funny thing was the split between the history class and the economics class. The economics class, the textbook, the person who taught us was actually a Marxist person, Parashar Chatterjee. But the textbook he used was Paul Samuelson's. Whereas the history class was completely Marxist. So I sometimes joke by saying that it was as though Nehru wanted managers whose memories were anti-colonial, but whose visions going forward were capitalist.
Capitalist.
So right. So you hated empires and imperialism, and you wanted capitalism. By the way, just to go back a little bit, I've got a friend asking me to say a few words about an English teacher we had outside of school.
Sure.
That both he and I went to when I was in Mitra Institution. It's a very funny story. We had there was a teacher of Bengali, or he taught English too, there in Mitra Institution called, he was a Chakrabarty. And he once looked at an essay of mine and wrote a remark which I'll never forget. And I've always thought this, one day if I wrote an autobiography, I mean, I would try to use this sentence as the title for my autobiography. He mixed English and Bengali, and he said, these old teachers were like, how you can tell if the rice is boiled by looking at one grain of rice.
Yes.
So they could they could take one look at you and decide what you were, the essence of you. And his comment said, originality, ache, there's originality. Substance, nai. There's no substance to what you've written. And I always think that should be the title of my autobiography. But he recommended that some of us go and take English lessons from a friend of his, Shoila Sengupta. Mm-hmm. He actually became a very big influence on my thinking. He was a very good teacher. I became close to his family. And also on my sense of English, because Shoilish Babu was the first Indian teacher who would look at a sentence of mine and tell me, Dipesh, this is grammatically right, but it's not English. Mm-hmm, so this sense that a language has idiomaticity, being idiomatic is part of language, learning that language. He was a wonderful, I still remember the sentence which he used, he made up, and he acted it out to teach us the clausal structure of a sentence. So he acted out the punctuations, partly with his voice and with his hand. He produced these mudras to actually teach an English sentence. And Devashish, my friend, was actually asking me to say something about him. So I just went back and told the story. But going back to IIM, yes. So my encounter was with this structure of Calcutta IIM, right? But the interesting thing was, it was not just the Marxists. It was not just the Marxists. Now I realize that there were the kind of 60s winds going to the business schools in the US, and they were taking up subjects that business schools today wouldn't imagine looking at. And one of the questions in our organization build behavior class came under the heading motivation, but asking a very fundamental question: why would people want to work for money?
Okay.
And it's a question. It's a completely existential historical question,
yes,
right?
Yes, absolutely.
And in that context, just as we read some psychology about the Maslow's need hierarchy and all that, but we actually were given to read Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts, which talked about alienation. And my very first encounter with German-American psychologists and even psychoanalysts like Erikson and Erich Fromm was at IIM, was in this classroom because there was a really radical wing to the thinking that we were experiencing IIM. The other great thing about IIM, I should also tell you, going from Kolkata University to IIM, first of all, we were encouraged to address our teachers by their first names. It was very awkward. We could with some who looked younger, and we couldn't with those who looked too senior to be called Borun and Nitesh. We just couldn't do it. Right? But the other thing was, and this will sound strange today, but it felt like freedom then. You were allowed to smoke in class.
Okay.
And in fact, I still remember that Borun Day would. This is not a gallery, so it was a flat room, and he would walk up and down the aisle while lecturing. And if you had your cigarette packet out, Borun Babu would unfailingly bum cigarettes from you. So people used to hide their cigarette packets if they didn't have many cigarettes with them. So the Borun Babu didn't take cigarette from them. I've got a request from a very dear friend from my presidency saying, say something about Presidency College. So maybe we can go back to Presidency College at some point. But I just simply telling you that IIM, without IIM, my turn to the humanities, my turn to initially social science and then humanities. So what happened was the history I learned was very heavily influenced by the social sciences. In fact, this distinction between social science and humanities didn't become absolutely clear to me until I came to Chicago. And Chicago University makes a very clear administrative division between the humanities and social sciences. Mm-hmm. And they produce an intellectual justification for it. And we have to practice it. I'm appointed in both divisions. So when I teach the same text in two divisions, I teach them separately, differently. Right. So, but my exposure to...
Dipesh, okay, sorry, one quick point. What's happening, unfortunately, there's a little bit of like a 5-10 second lag. So sometimes what's happening is it appears as if we're talking over each other. But I just wanted you to be sort of conscious of that this is happening. Dipesh, I wanted to ask you, back in the time when you were at IIM Kolkata, right? There was this 1 year, if I'm not mistaken, as you had told me, where you were Borun Day student and you were the only student. So one professor and one student, right?
Actually 2 years, because 1 year while I was doing my master's, because so my first year Borun Day was in Shimla at the Advanced Studies Institute, and Shobhashati Bhattacharya, another dear historian friend and older brother figure who died last year, Shobhashati taught us the history course, and then Borun came back, and everybody had sung his praise, and I went to see him. And I still remember I'm saying to Borun Day that I want to do your courses, but your courses won't get me a job. This is like my father speaking through me to Borun Day, saying, but your courses won't get me a job. So can I just take your courses in elective subjects while specializing in a functional area of business? And then I do 2 or 3 classes with him, one-on-one. I think one was on the Industrial Revolution in England, history of that. One was on the formation of the working class in India, which was when the basis was laid for my eventual book on working class history.
Right.
And those are the 2 courses I remember. And when I eventually got my degree and got a job with a Scottish company in India, Borun Babu asked me if I wanted to be a manager or would I rather do history, because I was just going to start the equivalent of a doctoral program.
Doctoral program, right? Integrated program.
Right, but I had found doing history so comforting and so and speaking so much to the sense of defeat I had carried with me ever since giving up on my radical options and retreating into what I thought was a cozy middle class life. And I decided that I belong to the rubbish heap of history, as Marxists would say. And then Sunday's history, which was kind of Marxist, but which explained, which made you feel like the bigger forces, economic forces, social, were much too big for the individuals. Yeah, but it kind of lifted my sense of guilt. I sort of felt I'm too small to really make any changes to things, but I can understand why changes happen. And I said to
Right.
Bruno, I will do history, because at that point it felt like if I didn't do history, my life would be meaningless. So then, for 1 year, as you were saying, as part of that doctoral program, he taught me one-on-one. But it was not just classroom. I would be studying all day, and I'd be coming back home on the bus with Burnbo, and I'd be sitting next to him, and I'd give him an informal report on what I'd been reading. And anytime, I still remember one conversation where I'd been reading, I forget what book, but I told him, because I used to address him as sir, I said, sir, if this is true, but then it doesn't work with Marxism, what will, if this is true, what will I do with the Marxist theory? And I still remember Bourneau telling me, just remember that truth is more important than Marxism. I don't know if you would own or disown the story, but he told me that.
Wow.
So yes, that was wonderful, that 1 year of instruction.
So the matter of truth, right, is something that we'll definitely be coming back to later in the program,
Sure.
particularly when we're talking about your book on Sir Joe Donat. But the last question on your formative years, right, when you transitioned into history, who was your favorite historian? Whom did you really enjoy reading, and why?
Well, that's a very easy question to answer, because Born Babu, when he said, go and do working class history. And it made sense to me, because I used to think about a revolution. And my
Right.
question was, why didn't the revolution happen?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the right question, I thought, was to ask that, why did the working class not become revolutionary? We had no sense that, as I was saying to a friend the other day, the first fact about the lives of workers in India is about migrancy, that most workers are migrant workers. But anyway, but to inspire me, he showed me this big, huge book called The Making of the English Working Class, and said, can you do something like this? Now,
the other day, Dipesh da, when we were talking, you used the expression the thani ter moton.
Right, exactly. It's like a huge brick bat, like something you could use as a door stopper. and right. But Thompson, and I've read him so many times. Thompson was a historian with a romantic poet's heart. I mean, deep down, you were reading a romantic poet who was seizing a bit of history, but he was also extremely erudite and meticulous historian. There's no question. Every time you criticize Thompson would come out with page-long sort of replies to you.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a certain kind of passionate humanist Marxism. And what I've always loved in Thompson is this very un-English quality, to wear your passion on your sleeve. I mean, that's what Thompson seems to be to a Bengali. I mean, like, if you actually spoke to people who were friends of Thompson, like Christopher Hill, I've heard Christopher Hill and others say, "Oh, Edward is so sentimental," or "Oh, Edward is so emotional." But we Bengalis are emotional and sentimental.
Yes, and which is quite antithetical to the typical Brit with the stiff upper lip, right? Where everything is kind of internalized and behind the facade, right?
There's a very interesting phenomenon I'll share with you. So when I was doing my PhD in Canberra, there was a professor of Sanskrit and ancient Indian history, very, very well-known person called A.L. Basham. Basham used to teach in London. Basham produced generations of historians. One of his most famous students, I think, is Romila Thapar.
Yes.
So Indian students would often go back home, publish their books in India, and ask Basham to write a foreword to their books. But I knew Basham. Basham was a Pakka Englishman with a deep love for Indian texts.
Mm-hmm.
But these people for whom he wrote forewords, often in their acknowledgements, produced in the English language a sentiment that the English language doesn't carry very well. This is pure sentiment of bhakti. So they wrote extremely. So it was always very funny, because I knew exactly the sentiment that Basham's students were expressing. This was if you see bhakti, if you could say, "Sir, you're the biggest thing in life. You're the biggest thing God ever created. Without you, my life would be meaningless." All kinds of things that you can imagine us saying quite authentically, right? English doesn't carry these things very well. I mean, they in English they sound kind of too obsequious, a little sycophantic or whatever.
Yes, yes.
And I knew that Basham, knowing Basham, I knew that he would have cringed internally.
Mm-hmm. I mean, to use a very Philip Larkin term, very pithy term, Philip Larkin would look at all sentimentality and he'll say, that's a bit wet.
Right, exactly. And exactly. So Thompson, E.P. Thompson was wet. But at the same time, I can tell you, whenever I read an Indian historian, that is India-born, India-raised historian of India, trying to write history with this clipped British public school accent, it comes across to me as very, very inauthentic. It comes across to me as a book where the voice is trying to mimic somebody else's voice. That is not there.
So it's somebody trying to be somebody else as opposed to a very authentic voice with his own opinion, good or bad, right or wrong.
Yeah, so, exactly. So you have to, I mean, your material is English language, it's the global language of scholarship, but you have to try and wield it to express sentiments that you genuinely own without becoming too sentimental. I mean, Thompson was never too sentimental. I mean, he remained an Englishman after all. So that's why Thompson, for me, was a very happy kind of middle ground between that's stiff upper lip Englishness of the English, right? And the effusive sentimentalism that I was capable of producing. Having, bhakti flows in our blood. So once I wrote something about Rabindranath, and an Indian woman who's not a Bengali said to me as a compliment, she said, "Oh, Dipesh, what I liked was that it was also so critical of Tagore." So I said, but that doesn't mean that I can't show bhakti to him. It's just that this was an academic piece and I gave myself freedom to be critical. But the Bengali in me can always be effusively full of bhakti for somebody like Rabindranath. Right? So there's this question of language that you started with, and this is why I say I'm a deeply humanities person, was indeed very important. And this question that Debashish Ganguly, one of my friends watching on, asked, I think that goes back to the English teacher, Shailesh Sengupta, who really, I mean, he used to say, you have an ear for language, but he also helped me to prepare that ear to some degree. I mean, I really didn't have it until I came across him.
So Dipesh, when you were writing your own book, right, when you're talking about rethinking working class, was there ever a sense that maybe because of what Borunde had told you, that in some sense you had to emulate what E.P. Thompson had done in his Rise of the English Working Class? If not that, at least walk in the same footsteps, traverse the same paths. Did you have a sense of that when you were writing your own book?
When I started, but the problem was Thompson had a story to tell, at the end of which workers were, according to his story, acquiring class consciousness. And I had a story to tell in which, in my view, the workers never became class conscious in quite the same way. So for me, the question was, for him, the question was, how did these workers become self-conscious or class conscious? And for me, the question was, what were the obstacles to class consciousness? So in some ways, I basically wrote a history trying to argue why you couldn't do an E.P. Thompson for the Indian working class. And that's what made most of my Marxist friends very unhappy with what I did. Incidentally, going back to the history of Marxism, you raised this question. I'm also thinking of my friend Prashad Ranjan Rai's question about years in presidency college. Something that happened which was significant in our youth. And these are now material for research for younger scholars, was the publication of a novel by Somoresh Bose called Bibor, which came out in our first year in college. And I had some very dear friends in my first year, and Prashad was one of them. And I remember arguing with Prashad and others about this novel for hours on end. Prashad and Prashad's sister, whose opinion Didi's opinion Prashad would carry back to us. I remember they were very critical of the novel. And when the novel was published, Dilip Biswas, who was a very knowledgeable, extremely respected and respectable professor of history in Presidency College, immediately wrote this letter to Desh, because the annual Desh had carried the novel, about its obscenity. And this was a novel at the end of which, as far as I remember, the protagonist kills his lover. He urinates under the working desk of his father. And
Dipesh,
that novel was actually
sorry, Dipesh, a slight, not a complete digression, but he talked about your Marxist friend and what had made them you were made unpopular with them, and I'm getting a large number of questions to do with your involvement with the subaltern studies, right? So
the subaltern studies. Okay.
Talk to us about that.
Give me a minute to finish the story. Okay, let me. Well, this is connected. So let me finish this story, and I'll go to subaltern studies. So it'll take me a minute to finish it. So this novel actually brought existentialist questions into our lives. What is sexuality? What is morality? What is internal corruption, etc., etc., inauthenticity? And I remember, because we were also becoming leftists, we were invited to meet with a father from St. Xavier's College, who wanted to tell us that, look, while you were talking about Marxism, the rage in Paris is structuralism. And I remember coming back thinking, this father is just this is a right-wing conspiracy. He's trying to make us forget Marxism. So I didn't take any interest in structuralism, which came to the fore and became critically important intellectually when I joined subaltern studies. So when I was in England for 3 months to do my research, and I'd met Ranajit Guha, and there's a long story there, and I'll come to it. But Guha was then, he drafted the chapters of his book on peasant insurgencies. And those chapters were deeply, deeply informed and influenced by French structuralism. He was trying to combine sort of Hegel-inflected Marxist philosophy with French structuralism. So I met him, and immediately, I met him soon after I went to England. I spent a weekend, and when he inducted me into subaltern studies, as it were. And I became interested in structuralism. I thought there's a story there, I could come to it later. So I gave myself a kind of a class on structuralism. I bought all the books I could buy on structuralism, and I'd come back from my archive research at the end of the day, staying with friends, and read these books on structuralism. And there are very funny stories about structuralism, but the first intellectual area that opened up in our Marxism and in subaltern studies, and these were opened up by Ranajit Guha, who founded subaltern studies series, was intellectually, it was the area of this area that I'd call structuralism. But I was mentioning it to say that in my youth, I had a kind of abortive encounter with structuralism. I mean, it would have been so much fun if I'd actually explored structuralism then and listened to the father from St. Xavier's instead of thinking of him as a reactionary person trying to make us forget Marxism. But so that's kind of by way of segueing into subaltern studies in those years. So yeah.
So going forward, right, Dipesh, when you wrote the other book, Habitations of Modernity, right, what was the main theme in that book? What did you want to project through that book?
See, both Habitations of Modernity and Provincializing Europe, which came out 2 years before I did for Habitations. So I often tell people, okay, we're getting other questions, but I often tell people that really the first chapter of Provincializing Europe is the last chapter of working class history, rethinking working class history. Because by the time I finished writing my first book, my question became, I'd realized that Marx comes out of a huge, deep European heritage. I mean, nobody told us in Calcutta that this man was a classicist, that he had actually done his PhD on Epicurus. I became aware that the person who is most influencing my work had read only one book on Bengal. I mean, he didn't know very much about my history. So how come I went to this man to look for clairvoyance about my history? Why is this man who knew so little about my history is able to tell me so much about my history that can't be matched by people who actually knew the facts of my history? So that raised this question: what is the relationship between European thought, of which we are legatees, and the material of our life, and the fact that we had lives, our ancestors going far, far back before any European had arrived in India, right? So that became the question of provincializing Europe. So what kind of relationship can I have with European thought, which I described in Provincializing Europe as both indispensable and inadequate? So I would say that in many ways, Provincializing Europe kind of struggles with the question. And Habitations of Modernity, the collection of essays that in which the struggle is more muted. Because I think the resolutions that I had achieved for myself in Provincializing Europe, I carry on with in Habitations of Modernity. So I think that the tone is calmer. And Provincializing Europe was the book I needed to write in order to end the restlessness in me, in order to end the troubling relationship that I'd had with Calcutta Marxism. So that trouble eventually became the question. Roland Barthes says somewhere that a wound does not become a book until the wound has become a question. So European thought was wounding in some respect. It makes you forget your own traditions. It makes you forget that there have been other theories of the self, other theories of enjoyment, all kinds of things in Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit.
Yes.
And in that sense, it's wounding. At the same time, it's enabling, because when I was writing Provincializing Europe, I was very aware that somebody no less than Ambedkar had written somewhere that he wished Indian history began in France in 1789. So I realized that the Dalit critique of oppression and inequality, the modern Dalit critique, not the Bhakti critiques, would have been impossible without European thought, right? So it is indispensable and yet inadequate. Once I wrote those words out and tried to demonstrate that over several chapters, both theoretically and empirically, even Adda is one of those chapters, I felt I had resolved the tension. And I felt that I had given my own answer to what troubled me about the received Marxism. And so when you come to Habitations, which is published 2 years later, I think you'll find that the mood and the tone is much calmer.
Actually,
I made peace.
Dipesh, my sense is, and we talked about the importance of language and how that you sort of sensitized to that even when you were in school with your English tutor. We see a marked difference when we are talking about the language in Habitations, right? Not only is the tone calmer, it's mellower, but there is this almost like a new obsession or an insistence on precision, on taxonomy, right? And on the face of it, of course, it's a book on historiography, but some of the words, some of the sentences that you're talking about, right? You're talking about the calculus of modernity. And you're saying, if we have power and if we have capital, this is not an independent variable, and this power is not a dependent one. Now, that is the lexicon, that is the verbiage of maybe logical positivism, or it could be something that Rudolf Carnap, in his own way, he was trying to integrate, mathematics and inductive formal, inductive logic, and the natural sciences. I got the sense when I read the book that over and above the project and the theme that you articulated, underneath that, there was probably a deeper, I don't know, like a personal quest to arrive at an equivalence between the precision that is there in mathematics and the difficulty of formulation in language, the problems of historiography.
You're so right, and it's both sensitive and, in the good sense of the word, shrewd of you to notice that. Um, and you know who my model was, uh, of a philosopher whom I saw as combining beautifully precision with sensitivity, was Gaston Bachelard, the French philosopher, who had both written about science on the one hand and written about things like the sense of space in literature, like how is an attic different from the basement as space,
Mhm, mhm.
how your hand carries memory of an old door the moment you pull the latch, memories flood back. And here was a man who was actually, his language has that classical kind of um, property, which you actually find a lot of philosophers up until the beginning of the 19th century, when philosophers could manage to read science, because they used to look at
Right.
science as natural philosophy and do speculative philosophy at the same time. And you see this very fine-grained resolution of the tension between precision and sensitivity, between precision and the capacity to communicate ambiguity. See, because the thing is, when you're working with prose, there's a limit to precision, because prose always will be ambiguous. I mean, you remember the story that Hobbes once wanted to produce a dictionary where each word
Mhm.
would only have one meaning,
Yes.
and then realized it's absurd. You just can't do it, and that's why poetry plays around with the ambiguities of words. Poetry helps you see flashes of new meanings. Uh,
And
so
Dipishda,
I
just
think
just
the
talking
drive
about
toward,
Dipishda, talking about the
yeah,
words and the import of words, right? You write in the same book that, in passing, you're talking also about, let's say, Ronajit Guha's dominance without hegemony. So there is the narrative about what the book is all about, but there is also the critique, not just from a semantic standpoint, from an almost clinical, logical standpoint, where you're saying, okay, without, I'm trying to describe
right.
something which is, after all, a positive, creative, presumably very meaningful experience. And the word without has a negative valency, and that kind of destroys it, or kind of sort of weakens it.
Yeah. What is the question you're asking,
So what I'm
or
saying is,
you're
yes,
offering a comment? Yeah.
I was just offering the comment out there. Yes. Um,
Right. No,
Dipishda,
that's
we've
really
got
good.
quite a bit of ground more to cover, so maybe we'll go
Sure.
to one of my sort of favorite books that you've written, and that is The Calling of History, right? So it is the
The
book
comment
on
is true.
Jodhunath Sarkar, right? Sir Jodhunath Sarkar and his Empire of Truth. So tell us about this book, how it came to be sort of morphed into being, and what your main sort of theme is, and what your conclusion through that book is.
See, that book, which at one level tells a story of how history became a discipline, an academic discipline in India, and how history became a researchable subject, and how some people nutted out for themselves what the word research would mean to them. I mean, the word research is not God given. Uh, People forget, these days you go to a university and you do a PhD, and there's a system in place for you doing a PhD. So when people ask you, okay, you've done your master's, are you going to do a PhD now?
Mm-hmm.
You say yes or no, but the question has no complexity in it. And people forget that once in European universities, there were actually the debates about the degree of PhD. Because, the argument was that since Lord God is our master is the highest degree you could give to anybody. So the label doctor should be left for actually medical doctors. So these were debates that people went through. And what you regard as research, and how do you know that somebody has done research? And I think Jadunath Sarkar and Sardesai and his generation were struggling to both ask those questions, articulate them, um, and to uh, illustrate them by their own work, while while this was also being debated in society, they were themselves subject to debate, subject to public debate, which is not always pleasant to experience.
Of course.
But the deeper reason why I wrote the book was, I think, and sometimes you begin a project and you don't know why you're doing it. You keep asking. It's only after finishing a book that you often know why you wrote that book. And I'm sure you had the same experience finishing a book on Dara, which is a wonderful book, by the way.
Thank you.
I've gifted copies of that book to people. But so after I finished the book, and I was working on Jadunath Sarkar and climate change at the same time, and then at some point I took a year off to just work on the Sarkar project, finished it, and I've just finished my climate book, which is now in the printery. It's being printed as we speak. I got very interested in the whole question of truthfulness. In the sense that climate issue had already met with denial, disavowal, being made invisible in many countries. In fact, when I first wrote about climate change, and I wrote in Bangla, not only did it not get as much attention as it might have, only one historian used a reference from a footnote, but not the essay. A very close and dear friend of mine, who is unfortunately gone now, said to me, "These are all Western problems. This Earth is very big. We can't change climate or anything. This is why you're bothering yourself with this. These are all Western fads." So there was denial, disavowal, unacknowledgement, not wanting to see all those things on the climate question. And Jadunath was so fastidious in the matter of reporting the truth that, as you know from having read my book,
yes,
that he was in different editions of his Shivaji book. He changes the number of hours it took Shivaji to escape from Agra to Banaras.
Absolutely.
And the change in the hours, right, constantly, but the revision doesn't make any difference to his narrative. Yes. Doesn't have any consequence for the events he's dealing with. But there was this kind of, what Marc Bloch, the great French historian, says, the historian has to submit honestly to facts.
I mean, Dipesh, what we see is there's this complete sort of unflinching, unwavering commitment to what he sees as the truth, to research, to primary sources, and also to scholarship, the altar of scholarship in a very larger than life sense. And I remember, lest I forget, there's this wonderful anecdote where Jagadish Narayan Sarkar, right, as a young researcher, as a student, goes to meet the great Sir Jadunath. Narrate that story for us, please.
Well, I mean, I kind of use the story to create the opening sentences for my imaginary conversation with Sir Jadunath, right? Because the other Sarkar, Jagadish Narayan Sarkar, goes to Jadunath and to work in his library, and in his telling of the story, Jadunath just cracks the door open a little bit, just a little bit, and says in a very rude and rough way, "Kichai, what do you want?" and Jagadish Narayan Sarkar says, "Sir, I want to study in your library." And the next question comes out like a machine gun. Right. And he says, "I want to work on Jumla," and says, "Farsi jano? Do you know Persian?" And he says, "No." Then slam, the door is shut on his face, right? Then he goes back after a few years, having learned some. And the first question he opens is again, "Do you know Persian? Have you learned Persian?" And he said, "Yes." And then he lets him in. He said, "Now you're not going to waste time." And Jadunath actually used to cut off conversation in the middle of people's sentences if he thought his time was being wasted. On that question, there's a very, very interesting letter from Rabindranath to Prashanta Chandra Mahalanobis. Because you know that Rabindranath wanted Jadunath to serve on the executive committee of Vishwabharati, and Jadunath refused. He wrote a very hurtful letter to Rabindranath. He didn't have to be so hurtful, but he was extremely hurtful in that letter. And then Rabindranath says to Mahalanobis in private, he said, "I'm sorry that Jadu Babu didn't come on my committee, but there is such a powerful truthfulness in that man that I cannot not respect him. And what I realized was that the question of being truthful remains the important question for the historian, even if there is no final truth
Mhm, mhm.
in the
Indeed,
world,
indeed.
right? Whether in sciences, whether in the sciences. And so, in some ways, I realized that both on the climate question and on the question of history, what was drawing me at the same time to two seemingly very disparate
Completely
subjects
disparate.
in time and place,
Yes.
very disparate, completely, but was this question of truthfulness. And it takes one kind of form in my narrative in Jalna Sarkar book. And I also wanted to write a book where I wanted to just combine, if you may, if you will permit me to make this
Please.
claim, I try to combine precision with sensitivity in that Sarkar book, right? So, um, and in my climate book is different. It's more overtly philosophical. It's more overtly theoretical. It's different. I've finished it, but I realized that the truthfulness was the question that has interested me over the last 15 years, because one result of many movements throughout the world, long before there was Trump, was that we had intellectually moved over from the left to a post-truth condition, where we were really saying, with all good intentions, truth doesn't matter.
Mhm.
When people were allowed to say, my experience is my history, I don't need to go to the documents. And we thought this was a democratization of history, and it was, but it was at the expense of truthfulness. And in some ways, as I was getting older or whatever was happening to me, I was thinking there's a problem here, because suddenly in America, everybody was blaming Trump for the post-truth condition, but the post-truth condition had arrived before Trump. Sometimes with abetment on the part of leftist people, because in the process of becoming democratic, we were actually saying truth doesn't matter. And my response is, truth doesn't matter, but your truthfulness does.
Truthfulness does.
There is an ethical struggle. Exactly. Your truthfulness does.
So, Dipesh, you mentioned earlier, right, in passing, that if I were to write an autobiography, this is what my title would be, right? Now, going back to
Right.
The Calling of History,
Right.
and I've actually read the book, I think, with some care twice. And one of the levels at which it works, in my sense, is that there is at least a prelude to an autobiography in The Calling of History, because there is not just an equivalence, but there is a resonance. There is like a deja vu of connecting with the primary source in the same tactile, visceral way that an archaeologist connects. So, for example, when you're cooped up in the sort of cavernous, catacomb-like basement, right, the rare books division in the National Library, because they have not been digitized, they have not been microfilmed. So all the Sadesai Sarkar letters are there, and you have to literally read them with care and copy them by hand, right? And the journey that you take, right, to Sadesai's house, and the discovery of a little note in the waste paper markets, right till the end, where you have this imaginary dialogue, right? The narrator come author has an imaginary dialogue with the protagonist. I had the feeling that somewhere you're also saying that the calling of history was your calling as well.
Yes, in the sense that, so I'm obviously not the kind of historian that Sarkar was. But I think what I would underline in that expression, the calling of history, is the word calling.
Yes.
And as you know, the word calling has a theological provenance. Now, in fact, you know that Aurobindo's middle name was Aurobindo Ackroyd Ghosh, right? And the Ackroyds were an English couple who came to India, and there's a book about them. It's called India Called Them. Now, so calling had become a secular word, but it comes out of theology, and in Max Weber's use of the German word Beruf. So he makes a distinction in that very famous lecture he gave in 1917, if I remember right, called Science as Vocation. And mind you, when the Germans say science, it's Wissenschaft, right? So it doesn't simply mean the natural sciences. Even history is science, historical science. He made a distinction between profession and vocation. So if you're simply a historian, who is a historian because you got a PhD, you got a job, it's your job to turn out other PhDs or not, then you're a professional historian. You have an association, you become its member, you go to its conference, you present papers which become your CV. That's different from history being a calling, being a vocation. So in some ways, Sarkar and Max Weber, I mean, today they would be unpopular figures because, and I would share in that criticism, they were really asking for a certain kind of aristocracy of the mind. So if you had asked Jaduna would have said, not everybody should do PhD. Even though he was having to make compromises, because by the time he was getting old, his students were doing PhDs, and PhD was a degree, just a degree that you had to get.
Exactly.
But this distinction that Max Weber makes in 1917 between being a professional person and being a person who is called to do that, perform the duties of that profession. It's a very fundamental distinction. And the distinction is relevant to me only in the sense that you get called to do something when that something becomes a vehicle for expressing your truthfulness. And I use the word truthfulness advisedly because truthfulness means an inner ethical struggle you carry on with yourself. See, we're all born to biases and to prejudices.
Absolutely.
Right? This is something historians have to deal with, scientists also deal with it. There's a German philosopher called Gadamer, Hans-Georg Gadamer, who explains the word prejudice beautifully. He says, the word is prejudice. It is the judgment you have of someone before you have actually formally judged them. So as you grow up from your childhood on, you're raised into prejudices. Older people pass on to you prejudices. And they form the core of the bias in your mind. When you're a historian struggling with, to be truthful, you struggle against your biases as far as you can see them, but you have to watch out for them. So the difference is, when I was growing up, the history I was being taught said, wear your bias on your sleeve. Tell the reader, first page, I'm a Marxist. So this is the history I write. You can't challenge the fact that I'm a Marxist. And I say to my Marxist students that your Marxist history has to be right, not because you're a Marxist, but in spite of your being a Marxist.
So essentially, again, we are going beyond what could be not just a natural conscious bias, but something which is unconscious, which is subliminal. And we have to go beyond that and chip that away to get to the kernel of, again, truth.
And because you can never completely catch all your biases out.
Yes.
This is an unending internal ethical struggle that happens in the heart and mind of any seeker of knowledge. So the post-truth condition for me is one where you don't even acknowledge this ethical struggle, the need for it.
Absolutely. So Dipesh,
you see what I mean?
Sorry, Dipesh, I'm getting a number of questions from the viewers for you to connect your work on climate change with, of course, the COVID pandemic that we are facing today and the implications thereof. But before we go there, my last question, because this is something you explained to me, and I found it so fascinating, I can't resist asking this question. That last appendix, where you have an imaginary conversation, right, with the disembodied spirit of Sir Jodhunath, that is astonishing in the sense that not only would an academic historian, not dare to do such a thing, even writers of fiction who have written works, let's say, in a slightly similar vein. So, for example, the British writer Julian Barnes, who's talking about Gustave Flaubert, right, the Flaubert's parrot, even he would shy miles short of invoking the spirit of Gustave Flaubert. And here you have something that reads just like a radio play, like a play in itself. The last appendix. Why did you do that?
Well, many answers, but a quick one is that I was reacting to the fact that I had worked for 2 years in the house where Jadunath had lived and worked, with only the knowledge that Sir Jadunath lived there, but with no knowledge of how the house was inhabited by the family, where did he work, where was his office. So there was no sense of the way in which Sir Jadunath had actually inhabited that space.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted the space to have a haunting presence of Sir Jadunath. So you might call that imaginary conversation as an exercise in what Derrida used to call hauntology, as opposed to ontology, right? So I was Avik, I want to ask you, how much time do you think we have got? Because I can see that we are getting some urgent questions on
Yes. So,
ecology.
Dipesh,
so give me a.
Sorry, so Dipesh, we've actually gone a little bit beyond our allotted time, but now we'll jump into the kind of question that we are having like repeatedly. So talking about the ecological balance and connecting that with the COVID pandemic and what we are seeing across the world. So if you can, yeah.
So can you give me some sense, if possible, can you give me some sense of? I mean, I'm happy to. I'm a teacher. I'm a classroom person, so I'm happy to go on with seekers, with questioners for as long as you want. But can you give me some sense of the time we have? So that
yes, Dipesh, I would say something like the next 15 to 20 minutes, max.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Then I know how to kind of edit my questions.
Yes.
Then I know how to edit my answers. Okay. So shall we take some of the questions that people have asked? Why don't you select some? I can't quite read.
Let's have some of the questions around the COVID-19 pandemic flashed on screen, please.
So maybe, yeah.
Yes.
What should we follow to save the world? Look, there is an answer to that question, and the answer is very, very difficult to practice. So I'll begin by asking the question: why is it that in the last 20 years, 70% of the infectious diseases, new infectious diseases that humans have actually got, are all what they call zoonotic diseases? That is, diseases that happen, the infections have come from animals, mostly wild animals. It clearly has to do with destruction of wildlife habitat, increasing contact between humans and wildlife habitat. And the destruction of habitat has to do with many things: mining, forestry and timber logging, building habitations, housing, as is happening in Mumbai. Mumbai is expanding into leopard territory. Building housing for humans, clearing forests to create farmlands. Small people, poor people, because of livelihood and other factors, moving into animal territories, and illegal trade in wildlife. Now, why do I say it's very difficult to address them? Because a lot of this are so central to the kind of capitalism we have, the extractive capitalism. If you think of the present so-called Maoist movements going on in India, they're all going on in where forests are and where these mines are. So that's one factor. So we need to have, even if we need to go on having capitalism, we need to have other kinds of capitalism. I think this present capitalism is extremely destructive. Same goes for the cyclone. As you know, people have been saying that that the Bay of Bengal has historically been a breeder of cyclones. The mangroves that used to protect us are also getting destroyed, but also the sea is getting warmer in the Bay of Bengal, just as the sea on the California side is getting warmer in America than the sea on the Atlantic side. And when the sea gets warmer, you get stronger cyclones. And why is the sea getting warmer? It's getting warmer because of global climate change. Why is there global climate change? Because of things we do, use of fossil fuel, the emission of methane, all kinds of ways in which we basically are putting out so much carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases that the so-called natural sinks of the earth cannot absorb them fast enough for our purpose. I mean, if you give the earth time, the earth will absorb it, but it won't absorb it fast enough, which is why there's talk about geoengineering, carbon sequestration, and all of those things. So quickly to say that we need to argue, lobby, mobilize for definite changes to the kind of capitalism we live with. And it doesn't mean that I'm talking about destroying capitalism. I mean, you could. I mean, there's a valid question about whether capitalism should go, but that's not in our hands. But
Right.
look, the very well-known evolutionary biologist Edward Wilson at Harvard has an interesting book called Half Earth. And he's actually arguing that there are 140,000 national parks in the world. Now, most of these national parks, because of human intervention, have been dominated by what they call invasive species, because of the way, and species are not just animals, it could be plants, it could be any kind of form of life. And he's saying, let's at least restore these 140,000 national parks to the condition that they had before humans intervened. One of the richest places with biodiversity is the DMZ between South Korea and North Korea, right? People now actually, ecological tourists go near that place to see that. One thing we have to realize is that we have to make biodiversity into a non-renewal resource in the way that we think of fossil fuel. Because once biodiversity is destroyed, you kill life support system. And biodiversity takes millions of years to recover.
To renew.
To renew. So that's why we are heading towards a great extinction from everything I read. And we have to reverse that trend. That's where politics should be. Politics should be more sensitive to the climate question. They're not. I mean, you just have to look at our own politics. The COVID thing, I'll simply say this and take other questions. See, the COVID thing also shows how global history and planetary history are coming together. So it's very easy to see what's global about COVID, right? So there's an infection in China, and it has to do with Chinese traditional eating habits. It has to do with increasing demand for exotic food, the growth in the number of wet markets, so-called, which you also see in India and Bangalore and other places,
yes.
As construction happens. Now, then the Italians, so it's my kind of class, the global people who travel for business, for conference. So my class, which makes it global. And it immediately lays bare the assumptions of our life. Our lives depend on the assumptions of being able to connect through technology, through flight, through all of those things. So now suddenly we have these electronic platforms on which we connect. But it doesn't substitute for face-to-face connections. If your parents are now in India and you're in America, your parents are sick, what will you do? And that's happening to many families. I mean, I have a son in Australia I haven't seen for 2 years now. He and his mother, I haven't seen them for 2 years. I have, my wife has her mother in Chicago, in Calcutta, and we haven't seen them. Every time in summer we go. So it's not a replacement for physical thing. But think of it also as an event in the history of life, planetary history of life, because this virus, whose host reservoir was the bat, some kind of bat. Bats have been on this planet for 50 million years, much older species than humans. The virus is probably more than humans. The virus has probably lived in the bat's body, in guts, for millions of years. But if you take a Darwinian view of life, then every species, every life form is trying to create the best conditions for its survival. And we have suddenly become the amplifiers for this virus. Because we are crowded, we are many in number, we are global, we circulate. So as I often say that, look, we might win this battle with the virus by either creating a vaccine or maybe through the sad and tragic path of so-called herd immunity.
So
but that's very tragic and sad, isn't it?
So Dipesh, if I look at it, right? if I look at it right, there are two things here. One, as you pointed out elsewhere when we were talking, I think day before yesterday, is that on the one hand, humankind or the human species has evolved as a highly social animal, and at the same time, there's a conflict because the virus wants you to be antisocial, non-social, right?
Exactly. So, my students in Chicago, for instance, were making a deliberate choice in joining the protests to do with George Floyd's murder. And if you ask them, they would actually say, look, we can't care about the infection now. Because otherwise we can't protest, and you understand the choice.
Right.
There's something within us wanting to...
Because beyond the point, of course, there's the health hazard, there's the safety hazard, and there's the potential risk to life. But when also, something as dear to the human condition as the ethics and the values that one lives by are under threat, then your choice is very clear. You're going in. Yeah.
Your choice is very hard. Yeah.
The other thing that you mentioned, Dipesh, you talked about, let's say, herd immunity, right? And there is a clear ethical implication of that as well. So, for example, let's say the government says, or any authority says, we are going in for herd immunity, and we will have to accept and bear the consequences as collateral damage. I mean, that is a statement that can be a policy that to be implemented. But at the back end of that, there's this tremendous ethical problem around that, right? What's your view?
This tremendous callousness. The expression herd immunity, as I understand, it comes from animal studies.
Yes,
it comes from watching the epidemiology of diseases in animals, and the expression collateral damage. I mean, this is like the kind of thinking that you do when you're engaged in a war. So it's kind of and this imagination of collateral damage, that is the war affecting people whom I don't even know, right? So exactly. What frees you up to speak in this language is the fact that you assume that you would be personally distant from most of the people who become the collateral damage. Because if the collateral damage was your child, your parents, your spouse, your relative, you'd think differently. And to me, I was saying this in another interview, to me, what it suggests is that there's a deep cancer at the heart of democracies, because we have built democracies. We built democracies on such a scale, and I'm talking globally, I'm not just about India too,
sure.
that the democracies today don't depend on vibrant local communities that themselves have democratic lives. So whether you look at the debate in India about federalism, the whole complaint that what responsibility the center might have with respect to the cyclone or the migrant workers, you can see certain kind of callousness writ large over so many. I mean, the migrant workers kind of tragedy made it very clear how much callousness undergirds the democracy we have, and all I want is that for people who speak glibly of herd immunity without any sense of anguish, all I wish for is a democracy in which you could not do that. You could not speak glibly and without any sense of anguish about herd immunity. That may have to be the tragic path that we have to follow. But you have to underscore its trajectory.
But Dipesh, don't you think that the trajectory that we are taking, not just here, but in the US and elsewhere in the world, one of the biggest casualties, whether we are doing a lockdown or whether we are perforce keeping the economy open so that the markets, don't take a hit, the biggest casualty in all of this is our sense of empathy, which is also something that has taken us millions of years to evolve to a high level, and that is being sort of, diminished, degraded.
So what's happened. I mean, I hope this makes sense. So I'll put it in a very short form. So someone I know is a well-known sociologist in America has written a book on climate change, and it's called Capitalism in the Web of Life. And the web of life is an expression he takes from Darwin. but life in Darwin means life with capital L. So when you say life has survived a great extinction, so it's life with not individual lives. Like if Nietzsche talks about life, it's your individual life. Now, what I realized after the COVID pandemic is that the book should have been called, in my opinion, Capitalism in the Web of Social Life. Because what capitalism has destroyed is our social life, because it had colonized it. Our social life is so dependent on these economies of travel, the economics of computer. And you have to remember that that we are privileged to have this discussion on an electronic forum, the computer, there is a digital divide in the world. A lot of people don't have access to this kind of technology. So this is a practice of a privileged group of people. And so we can keep up our social life, at least a fraction of humanity can do that to that degree. But life, on the other hand, the virus belongs to that life with capital L. And it shows that once your social life has been colonized to this degree by a global neoliberal capitalist economy, an agent who is an agent in the history of life with capital L can knock you over. It can suddenly make your life unsocial. And as Avik was saying, I don't see him on the screen, I hope he comes back soon. And as Avik was saying, we were not, and I was saying to him too other day, that we did not evolve to have this kind of sociality. Avik, good to see you back. So I was just explaining that we did not, we evolved to be a very social animal.
Yes.
But our sociality has become so imbricated, particularly for the privileged classes, but also for the poor classes, so imbricated with the economy, the global neoliberal economy, that we are now vulnerable to agents of what I was calling the history of capital L life. See, this pandemic marks an event, not only in human life, it actually marks an event in the history of life on the planet. When this coronavirus, which used to have a very isolated life in a bat's gut, has now become global and has a global life. And that's an event in the history.
Absolutely. So, Dipesh, we are coming towards the end of our program. So, 2 or 3 questions before we wrap up. The first thing is,
sure,
we were talking earlier about the entire body of work that you've produced, but as you were mentioning in an earlier conversation, there is now a book that is written about you. So tell us a little bit about
that. That's true. So there's a book that's come out. It's edited by 3 younger, 1 political scientist and 2 historians. That's Ajay Skaria, Saurav Dubey, and Sanjay Seth. So the book is called Dipesh Chakrabarty and the Global South, it's really about my work. I'm very honored to have this kind of a book. But it's I'm hoping that there'll be an Indian edition available in India.
Lovely. So we'll definitely look forward to that. Another thing is, we've talked about the entire body of work that you've produced over the years and still continue to produce. And while there is rigorous methodology around that, and at times not just scientific but mathematical precision involved, my overall sense is, and this is something that I submitted to you earlier, my overall sense is that first and foremost, your intention is to create lasting works of art. And in that sense, as much as you're a social scientist, a natural scientist, a physicist, or a mathematician at heart, you're first and foremost probably an artist. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think that's a very high compliment. I would thank you for paying me the compliment. I mean, what can I say? It's very kind of you to say that. All I can say is that because of my nature, my confusions, the way I've grown up, working between disciplines and thinking through multiple disciplines, of which I understand some well, and some I understand only a little bit, but I try to make sure that my understanding is fair. I've been very privileged, I feel, to be able to enjoy what I do. And there I'm very grateful to the institutions, both in India and overseas, that I've worked at, to friends and colleagues the world over who have taught me so much. I'll just end with this story. This
Please.
morning I got up at 2. I was 2 in the morning. I was up from 2 to 5. I was discussing and finishing an article I've been writing with a French intellectual, a very well-known man, much more celebrated than I am. And he had sent me a paragraph saying, "Have I gotten you right?" So I had my own comments intercalated in his paragraph, which is so I sent it back to him, and he wrote to me saying, which was grateful. He said, "Dipesh, this is great. It's like the best of conversations that is so rare these days." And in my response, I wrote back, and this goes back to the theme of adda, the value of speech.
Yes.
And I wrote back saying that, conversation was extremely valued in the 18th century. When Gibbon died, the historian, in his epitaph, he wanted it mentioned that he was a very good conversationalist. And Immanuel Kant was famous for the conversations he had with people over lunch, except for the last 20 years of his life, when he decided to be completely asocial or antisocial, to write the books and finish the books he wanted to write. And so I was sort of saying that, there's a possibility that an open-ended conversation was much more valued by the Enlightenment people, whereas the post-Enlightenment Marx and Lenin and that tradition may have taught us to value polemics more than conversation. And I'm a person who is always for a conversation rather than for a polemical, adversarial encounter.
Absolutely. And I think what this, I'm privileged to say this, what this really, really engaging adda proves to me, and you mentioned this in your essay on adda, that, Shoten Bose, someone like the physicist Shoten Bose, would be called adda raja. So I think we can now begin to count you, certainly, as one of the adda rajas, as the adda greats.
Or at least as a courtier. As a courtier
in the grand darbar of adda, of all time. Dipesh, it's been an absolute privilege and honor, an absolute delight talking to you. And viewers, hope you enjoyed the special episode. I know we went well over time, but we had so many themes, so much ground to cover, and so many questions coming in. Hope this was insightful. We come back again with another guest, same time next week. Until then,
thank you, and I just apologize to people whose questions I couldn't answer. We didn't have time to answer, but thank you very much, Avik, for having me on this program. I really enjoyed it, and I felt honored by it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.